In tonight's other major story, a gunman in New York City last night assassinated Meir Kahane, the fiery rabbi who founded the Jewish Defense League and advocated driving all Arabs from Israel.
The 58-year-old Brooklyn-born rabbi was shot in the neck at a New York hotel last night, moments after speaking to a Zionist group. His gunman ran to the street, seizing a taxi before being...
We're not playing games here. We are facing an Arab enemy who would slaughter us, who would bring upon us a holocaust of hatchets and knives. They would do to us what they do to themselves. We're dealing with a people that is unbelievably cruel.
Today on Public Research, historians Menachem Butler of Tablet Magazine and Harvard Law School and Zev Eleff, historian and president of Gratz College, on their article, Why Is Meir Kahane Making a Comeback Among Orthodox Jews? The life and times of that most controversial American rabbi and Israeli Knesset member, the Soviet Jewry movement, the JDL, and how the American Jewish community and Israel itself has changed in the decades since Kahane's assassination in 1990.
He released a certain tension, particularly in the Hebron area, Kiryat Arba area, of a certain fundamentalism. He unlocked a certain anxiety about this fundamentalist, politically conservative impulse in Israel.
The JDL was outspoken on behalf of Soviet Jews, but criticized for militant tactics. Kahane had lived in Israel since the early 1970s, preaching the politics of extremism and finding enough support to win a seat in Israel's parliament. He held it for just one term, barred from re-election.
Even when he was serving in the Knesset, there were members of the parliament who would not stay in the room with him. And these are members of the Knesset who would sit with Arab politicians, but there was something pernicious about Kahane that it was too close. He wore his yarmulke. He wore, he was trying to be, a new Zionist, that came forth from America to Israel. And look, I think a lot of the people who moved to Israel, who became his either actual followers or spiritual heirs or disciples, they all took different aspects of what his legacy was.
So we're talking about your article in 1840, Why Is Meir Kahane Making a Comeback Among Orthodox Jews? To begin with, can you guys maybe talk about who you are, how you came to collaborate, and sort of the basics of what your article is about?
Sure. So first of all, Daniel, thank you for having us on. Zev and I have been friends for over 20 years, and it was actually a project 5 years ago. Yeah, wow, 5 years ago during COVID, when we recorded an episode about some of this research that later turned into this article that we just published. But taking a step back, my name is Menachem Butler. I studied Jewish history at Yeshiva University, where I met Zev as well. And fast forward almost 20 years, professionally, I work at Harvard Law School in a program on Jewish and Israeli law, as well as an editor at Tablet Magazine. And I'm involved in a number of academic research projects within the Jewish communal space, Jewish history. And I'm also, living my life as a religious Zionist, modern Orthodox Jew. And especially since October 7th, it's kind of hard to separate the past and the present. And, maybe it's the academic researcher in me that I see history, wherever I turn. And, Zev can give a little introduction to himself, and then we can get to how we got to this specific topic as well.
Yeah. Thanks for having me as well, Daniel. So Zev Eleff. I have the distinct and beautiful privilege of serving as president of Gratz College, right outside of Philadelphia. We just bought a campus actually in Bala Cynwyd. Gratz is the oldest independent Jewish college in North America, we like to say. Also professor of American Jewish history. Menachem lives in Boston. I trained in Boston at Brandeis University with our beloved teacher, Jonathan Sarna. Um, and written about 19th century Reform Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, the 20th century. Written a little bit about Jews in sports lately, but this was a very timely piece. It was actually something that it was one of those funny things that we didn't have to rush to write an article because of a clash of a historical moment. We actually had it in process and been marinating for a number of years.
And actually, the title, the working title of that article was Meir Kahane and the Modern Orthodox. Then shifted to Meir Kahane and the Orthodox, and different titles. But the nature of our research, and this is really to Zev's credit, a lot of the sorts of what is a historical source when talking about the contemporary Orthodox community. By contemporary, let's refer to the past, 50, 60 years. Yes, there are rabbinic pronouncements, there are statements, but there also are all sorts of ephemera, advertisements in newspapers, letters to the editor of newspapers, op-eds in newspapers. And for some unrelated, prior to getting into the research about Meir Kahane, I had gone through the Jewish Press on Microfilm, which is a Brooklyn-based newspaper. And very often I would call Zev. He'd be like, "Yeah, I saw that a few months ago. Did you see 2 months later what happened? The follow-up?" And like that's sort of just trying to like imagine this community, which is it's not the high society, intellectual, religious of Manhattan, Chicago, Los Angeles. Just it's a different type of community. And as I was reading through the issues of the Jewish press, I noticed that Rabbi Meir Kahane had an article there, and two articles. Then, as I continued doing more research, he actually had 7 articles a week under 6 pseudonyms, and it was a fascinating, and that was his,
Were they all opinion?
I mean, some of them were called news.
Okay.
From the perspective of Rabbi Meir Kahane. I would say it's more of editorializing. And really, that's one of the beautiful things about doing research in a newspaper of a particular community, because you can, if let's say we're talking about in the 1970s or specifically in the 80s, there are other Jewish newspapers at the time, the JTA, often seen as the gold standard of the equivalent of like an Associated Press, of Judaism, the Jewish community. And then you have the Jewish Week with its own articles and editorials and op-eds and what I would describe as the alphabet soup of American Jewish communal life, writing their op-eds there. Then you have letters to the editor, and then you sometimes get Jerusalem Post and overseas. And as the 80s turned into the 90s, the Forward is then established. Just all these different, London Jewish Chronicle is existing in England and California. There's some newspapers, Chicago, Baltimore, Washington, Florida, and all of a sudden it becomes, in my reading of these papers, it becomes less about what's the event that happened, and it's more of how has this event been interpreted or presented or distorted, or we really didn't distort it, or yes, you did distort it, or all the communal follow through. And it's in that sense of I would read the newspapers not for what happened in the news, although it is interesting when an event is not covered in the papers. That's also a question to ask. And Zev and I began to realize that there's a story to be told, specifically about the 1980s. Here are some sources that hadn't really been part of the broader academic or even communal. And by communal, I refer to in the Orthodox community, in the communal discourse.
So I want to back up. I was watching I love Zev Brenner. It's such a window into a world for me. I was watching your interview with him, and I'm a Reformed Jew from Chicago. So, there's a sort of, I don't know, inferiority complex is some of the Yiddish words you were using, or that I don't know, or not Yiddish, but some of the terms. Can you talk about because I interviewed a famous rabbi last night, and I made a very embarrassing mistake. I asked him about the Rebbe, like an idiot, thinking that I didn't realize he wasn't Chabad, and it was.
It's actually very interesting you said that, Daniel, because it's actually that specific point is very interesting because nowadays there are many different Hasidic communities that each have their own Rebbe, and they'll each refer to their Rebbe. But the Skvera Rebbe, the Grand Rabbi of New Square, New York, his followers, let's say, aren't active on social media.
Yeah.
So, Chabad Lubavitch, when we could get to this point a little while, and we did address this in Zev Brenner's interview, the Rebbe by itself is Chabad. It's also Satmar. Yeah. It's also New Square. It's also Bubba and Bells. And, so it's like an interesting...
What I was going to ask is, for an outsider, what strain, I don't know if I'm using the right term, what strain of Orthodoxy did Kahane come from? Where did he grow up?
Well, he grew up as the son of an Orthodox rabbi into a rabbinic family, and he identified always as an Orthodox Jew, an Orthodox rabbi. His ordination is from an Orthodox institution.
I would also say a non-Hasidic Orthodox rabbi. So there are Hasidic rabbis and non-Hasidic rabbis. The tradition that his family was from was more of like a Eastern European, Lithuanian, and he studied at a prominent yeshiva in Brooklyn, New York, called the Meir Yeshiva, named after the town of Mir, Poland.
But there's no question. There's no question that Kahane always identified as an Orthodox. But truth is, Meir Kahane, although he served for a short time as a community rabbi, he was not a very successful community rabbi. His prominence did not fall neatly into these religious movements, Orthodox Reform or conservative. Although certainly he was committed to Orthodoxy, and so were many of his followers, he transcends typical denominational barriers.
Now, I think he's a young child during the Holocaust, right? But does he have memories about that era that he writes about or talks about?
He actually has a memory. It's interesting to phrase it this way. He has a memory that his parents told him about something that happened in his family. It's not exactly a memory that he had himself, but it became part of his familial story about a relative of his who, during the 1929 Arab riots in pre-state Palestine, was driving back, I believe it was from Safed to Tiberias or somewhere, and was killed in a terrorist attack. And that was a episode, Arabs killing Jews. That's something that he had been told, that story, earlier in his life. Now, I can imagine when his parents and family told him that story as a child, it was being told as, this is a story within our family. There wasn't and now so too, on the streets of New York, we're going to go and, commit this sorts of violence. It actually didn't enter that way, but it became part of his historical memory, so much so that in his later years, when he would, when people would criticize him and raise issues about the settlements, and it's the settlements that's causing the violence against the Jews in the state of Israel, he would say, were the settlements there in 1929? I mean, he recognized the role of 1929 as a defining moment in the Arab-Israeli conflict. But he was a student in yeshiva in New York. I shared an anecdote in that Zev Brenner story of he was sitting in the Beit Midrash in the study hall, and his teacher, Rabbi Kalmanovitz, who was himself a refugee from Eastern Europe and who was active in saving Jews and defense and advocacy in public square for the Jewish community, had asked this young student, Meir Kahane, to I believe it was send a letter, to go to the post office, to go down to Washington when he was much younger. And he's like, oh, okay, I'll do it when I'm finishing to learn. And his teacher just said, when Jewish when Jewish blood is at stake, you can't just sit and learn. And again, it's not that his teacher was saying then, and you go out and you do but each of these details contribute to his the creation of his activities and his political view.
So just to jump ahead for time's sake, so he becomes prominent through the Jewish Defense League, JDL. Around the late 1960s, we see the rise of Black Power, this sort of Jewish power. Now, I had a question about his.
Not sort of. This is Jewish power.
Yeah, no, exactly. I had a question about his relationship with black activists, because I know there's a story that there was a black activist who went to a prominent synagogue asking for reparations for slavery, and Kahane was very angry about this and it was involved in some kind of counter-protest. But you also say he admired or also had he seems to have had complicated feelings about the sort of Black Power movement.
He read the publications of the Black Panthers. He saw how they were phrasing ideas, and he recognized, he tried to find in his interpretation the good that every community was doing for what their activities were. And we mentioned in that Zev Brenner about the Black Panthers, but he also had a relationship with the Colombo family. And there's an anecdote that one of his followers writes in a newspaper article that he was together with Joe Colombo and Meir Kahane. And Kahane said, and Colombo said, I believe the line was, why are you using baseball bats? You could use a golf club. And Kahane said, yeah, but a baseball bat's much cheaper and it's more durable. But like that sort of, literally as he's having similar conversations with activists in the African American community, and there was something that was not done within the Jewish community.
I think that it's what's important to understand is that while Kahane certainly was not an ally of the Black community, he was somebody who had to learn. He was part of an ethos. He was part of a culture. Whether it be Colombo or anybody else, he understood that Jewish power was part of that multi-ethnic, that chase after multi-ethnic identity in the United States, particularly in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And he embraced that. He was willing to learn from other models of it.
So for younger Jews, the Soviet Jewry movement, I think, is a lot of them aren't even aware of it. But it was remarkable reading your article. I mean, we have bombings. I had no idea about this. A talent agency is blown up. Can you explain? I was shocked by this. They took over a synagogue, a Park East synagogue. Can you sort of explain what was the movement for Soviet Jewry and these sort of crazy JDL actions that happened?
Right.
So they didn't only take over synagogues, they also took over Einstein Medical School and the dean's office. I mean, they took over the Federation offices. They if there was a glass window in front of an office, they would bring a bowling ball and say, okay, if you don't meet with it, we're gonna break the thing. That was sort of activism. So the issue with the synagogue was the Soviet consulate, I believe, in New York was right across the street from Park East Synagogue on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And they wanted to stage a protest of the against the consulate. Now, it is a very Kahane experience that this synagogue is literally across the street and the establishment doesn't do anything, but we'll go in and we'll show what.
Right. It wasn't a protest against Park East Synagogue.
Right.
The fact that that Schneier, that its rabbi, felt alienated from the Orthodox. How could he do this to me? It betokens this interesting relationship between Kahane and the Orthodox.
Well, and also the other synagogues, and it's not that people wanted to get involved. It's look, that's your problem. It's not our problem.
Right.
So Could you briefly, for the audience, just what was the movement for Soviet Jewry?
Well, just a step before then, in
Yeah.
1968, the JDL began as a community watch organization, as it were. Halloween 1968, there were in 1966, 67, 68, there were the cemeteries, the Jewish cemeteries were bore the brunt of Halloween night, raids of sorts. Kids in the community and members of the Jewish community went to the police in 1968 and said, could you please provide security for the cemetery? And the police department's like, again, think of it, 1968 New York. Police department's like, we're actually going to focus on living people, to protect. And so some community members were talking to Meir Kahane, and he said, okay, let's get some baseball bats and we'll wait outside the cemetery. And that sort of like showing, that we're taking care of the community. And then there were instances of members of the Jewish community were beaten up on the Sabbath and other times. And the Jews felt the police aren't, they're not there for us. We need to have our own, community watch, as it were. And that was like the founding advocacy of it. At the same time, and Zev to take over about just the Soviet Jewry movement writ large, and then
the Soviet Jewry movement really comes to form in the mid 1960s, and it becomes the Jewish civil rights movement. Shalom Keller's written a fabulous book, just won the National Jewish Book Award for documenting this. And it becomes the Jewish issue. This is much later, the marquee figure becomes Natan Sharansky. What's interesting is that for Kahane's perspective, he's not the focal rabbinic figure by any means as a part of this movement, but there's no question that this notion of Jewish power locally, he is generating attention and energy, inspiration from this rallying around Soviet Jewry on behalf of the Jewish community.
Right. And just in terms of the historical memory, another rabbi on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, Rabbi Haskell Lookstein, a prominent modern Orthodox rabbi, wrote his dissertation in a book called Were We Our Brothers' Keepers about American Jews during the Holocaust. And it's fair to say that for a lot of the Soviet Jewry activists, children, I believe Yossi Klein Halevi even writes this in his memoir, that he wanted to get involved as a teenager in Soviet Jewry activism. He got involved with the JDL, but it was because our parents' generation didn't get involved.
And just for the audience, the issue, and correct me if I'm wrong, the issue was that there were Jews in the Soviet Union that wanted to move to Israel, that were prevented and persecuted. But Sharansky was put in jail.
There were Jews in the Soviet Union who were not able to practice their experience, their hope of Judaism, as well as want to emigrate. There was no official state, the religion wasn't allowed to be observed. And, a large number, Sharansky goes to jail because he wants to move to Israel, but it's not only the wanting to leave Israel.
Yes, sorry for...
And these people were known as refuseniks
Right. And eventually they bomb. I mean, can you just explain why did they bomb a talent agency?
The Sal Hurak Talent Agency was representing, I believe, a troupe, I don't know if that's the right term, of ballerinas that were going to come from the Soviet Union. And they were essentially their marketing service. And Hurak's Jewish background, as well as that particular client, was too much for Kahane, or certainly for the JDL. He was never implicated.
Right. So eventually he moves to Israel. Why does he do that?
There are reasons that he gives. There's reasons he feels that he feels that he ran the course of what he could accomplish in New York. There was institutional infrastructure infighting within the JDL. He got very, I mean, he was profiled on the front page of the New York Times.
Remember, since he formed the JDL, we've had the 6 Day War. American Jewry's attention has been fixed for the last 4 years before he emigrates to Israel. He and everybody else are focused squarely on Israel.
I mean, there's that line in our article. I think it's in the final draft of it that we published, Zev, where one of his followers says, Meir Kahane moving to Israel, that's the final solution.
Right.
And just, that's a heavy phrase as myself as an American Jew to hear that phrase, and grandchild of Holocaust survivors to hear that phrase now. It's that's the way they spoke, because it's we're just going to keep on keeping on locally in America. And what's interesting, after he moves to Israel, the New York Times then has New York Magazine has an article on the top 10 rabbis in New York. And Kahane doesn't make the list because he officially moves to Israel. He had officially moved to Israel, and an Orthodox communal activist and writer, Dr. Marvin Schick, writes an article in the Jewish press about Meir Kahane, who didn't make the New York Magazine listing because even though he's there, he's still very much here. He was one of the early transnational flyers back and forth from Israel.
And he's always coming here.
Yeah.
He's incarcerated there.
Do you guys know Hebrew?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. How was his Hebrew?
He's fluent.
He was fluent, but what's even more than that, I mentioned in the Zev Brenner interview that in his childhood, he struggled with a very serious stutter. And his wife, Libby, in her biography of Meir Kahane in the early years, talks about how he went to Israel as in his early 20s, and he wanted to be a rabbi there, and he just couldn't hack it in the community there. The speaking it didn't work. He came back to America. He perfected his speeches, his rhetoric, and by that I don't mean the content of it, but the form of it. And he became when you listen to him, the cadences of him speaking, he was speaking with an American accent, certainly, but he wasn't trying to hide it. That was.
Has there ever been an American Jew that's moved to Israel that's made a bigger, quicker splash in Israel than him?
I'll leave that to Zev to ask him if he can reflect on Golda Meir. Would she be considered an American Jew? I mean,
yeah.
Has there ever been Chaim? I mean, from Chaim Weizmann, although was British, so I'm thinking about an Anglo who has somebody made such a quick impact?
But again, Kahane's impact was American. It was an American, he brought that to Israel. Maybe the arrival of IKEA in Israel, that could have been
sort of what I'm getting at is I just imagine the perspective of the Sabras, the native Israeli Jews. I could imagine some resentment about this guy coming over, and how did the Israeli establishment view him and receive him?
So interesting. He moves to Israel in 1971. He's back and forth for the next decade or so. He aspires to join the Knesset as a member of parliament. He finally wins a seat in 1983. And there's been a lot of research about, who voted for him, which communities had voted for him. And he actually received the votes mostly from Israeli urban Sephardic Jews who felt disenfranchised, and he was able, as one who was disenfranchised himself, he was able to recognize and speak to what would be their strength or their interest in supporting. He was not welcomed in the Hebrew University, high society German. It's a different type of community.
But he released a certain tension, particularly in the Hebron area, Kiryat Arba area, of a certain fundamentalism. Important that the 1929 Hebron massacre, there's new research about this. He unlocked a certain anxiety about this fundamentalist, politically conservative impulse in Israel. And Israel is certainly at the time was a liberal government, and the Supreme Court outlawing Kahanaism as racism was meant to check that impulse, certainly.
For the audience, what were his? Let's maybe compare him to Menachem Begin. Like compare and contrast. What were his beliefs? What was he running on?
So yes, so Kahana viewed himself, or he attached a prehistory to himself of a Jabotinskyite Zionism.
He wanted to expel every Arab out of Israel, or
right. Okay, so this is right. So Kahana had as a diagnosis, he recognized that the state of Israel struggles with an identity issue of being a Jewish state and a democracy. And this is something you can go to Jerusalem any night of the week, and there are going to be forums and conversations about this. And he took a stand saying, look, obviously Israel has to be a Jewish state because the first state in 2,000 years, the Jews to rescue the Jews, to save the Jews. But also we have to be a democracy. And if we're a democracy, we should give citizenship rights to everybody who's living here. And therefore, if you're going to give citizenship rights to everybody, what about all the Arabs? And that means there will be more Arabs than Jews. And I don't know what the answer should be, but I'm just raising these questions. And he asked that publicly, very publicly, in ways that other politicians had not asked those questions. They might have known the demographic challenge, but they weren't raising it as possibilities or raising it in the 70s, and especially in the 80s.
In the early 80s, certainly.
Early 80s, certainly. And
remember, this is Menachem Begin after the David Accords. This is after shaking hands with Anwar Sadat and achieving a peace treaty with Egypt. In some ways, Begin let down a certain type of fundamentalism, and that political depression was ready and willing to take up the mantle with Meir Kahane.
In a number of his interviews, especially I believe in one of the CNN interviews in the 80s, he has this line where somebody says, you're anti-Arab, and he says, no, I respect the Arabs. I respect them. It's you, the Jew, the Israeli, who's just going to give them a little land, and you don't respect them. I understand. I mean,
the problem of the West Bank is an insoluble one. If we keep on thinking in terms of coexistence, the Arabs believe it is their country. I understand the Arabs. I respect the Arabs. There's no coexistence possible with them. They have to leave.
There was a certain the way that he would present, it was very sarcastic at times.
He would often ask, do you think Arabs love singing Hatikva, the Jewish soul yearns?
Now, Kahane, though, that's part of why he came back to the United States, not just for fundraising purposes, was because he had a larger audience here.
I'm curious, another politician I've been sort of fascinated by, who's alive now, is Moshe Feiglin. Sort of interesting. He believes the borders of Israel should be the Nile and the Euphrates. Was Kahane that extreme? Did he have was he that sort of out there?
He believed that the land that Israel won after 1967. I have to double check what he thought about 56 with the Sinai. I'm sure he said we should get the Sinai back as well. It has to be. This is the land of the Jews. This is where we should be. This is where everybody should be. Where all Jews should be. And if you're not going to be there, you can at least support those who are there.
Feiglin, of course, draws a certain amount of inspiration and stature from being, at least intellectually and politically, a disciple of Kahane.
Yeah, and they both have that real self-assuredness, I notice, in the way they...
I believe it's called swagger, the way that they would move.
Yeah. Were you going to say something, Zev?
Only Hebrew versus English is an interesting thing. A certain type of moxie or bravado in Israel and America look different. But I suppose there's a relationship. I see it.
Quickly, who won the Dershowitz-Kahane debate?
Depends who you ask.
In your...
I mean, it's we call them debates. Okay. I don't know if debate is the right term for it. It's more of two separate conversations happening.
Dershowitz was never felt, as frustrated and as intellectually and emotionally worn. And that's a theme with a lot of people who sparred with Kahane than when he faced off against Meir Kahane.
And I want to start by indicating why I am debating Rabbi Kahane. I'm debating Rabbi Kahane here tonight because too few blacks debated and responded to Jesse Jackson and Louis Farrakhan. I'm debating Rabbi Kahane here tonight because no Arabs debate Yasser Arafat. I think it's imperative that the world know not only that the vast majority of Jews repudiate Rabbi Kahane's views, but also why we repudiate those views. I'm here tonight to put the lie to those PLO protesters who stood outside of Rabbi Kahane's talk at Brookline just a month ago and claimed that there are no differences between Rabbi Kahane's views and the views of peace-loving Israelis and peace-loving American Jews and Americans who support Israel.
Wow, that's saying something. Yeah, he was a very talented speaker. Is there a clip, someone could look up on YouTube that you think embodies, his essence or in a way?
Alan Dershowitz v. Meir Kahane, 1985 debate. There's another very interesting debate. Rabbi Meir Kahane debates Michael Lerner from Tikkun. That's just its own fascinating debate in that here you have Rabbi Meir Kahane as an Orthodox rabbi, politically right-wing, religiously Orthodox, opening and having a conversation with somebody of a religious leader, a rabbi of the progressive community. And it's just that wasn't something that happened. And he was doing that alongside all of his other...
In some ways, the idiosyncrasy and the irony is that there was no greater bridge builder in American Judaism than Meir Kahane.
Yeah.
But that was him.
I want to move to Ben Gvir, but just quickly, was there any view, you said he wrote so often, and I was thinking he must have had some surprising takes maybe in all the writing. Is there any views he had, like he loved disco music or something, like anything surprising?
He was extremely consistent. And as the years went on in his writing, he became more articulate and more consistent and doubling down and tripling down. What I personally found very interesting in the research, so he was a reporter, later an editor at the Jewish Press in his early years in the 60s. And then there was a famous newspaper strike in New York. And this is like, there have been books on this topic in New York City history. And the Jewish Press wasn't running. And he started writing for a smaller paper as a sports writer, and he was a sports writer, and he loved sports, and he went to Knicks games, he went to Yankee games, he went to football games, he went to college sports.
I think Meir Kahane was a Yankee fan, and that's interesting too. In the world of Jewish Mets fans, I've always thought it very peculiar that he didn't. There's a certain genteelness about Mets fandom. There's something about the New York Mets and the Jews. I
think the Yankees is more established. It's older. They have to move from Brooklyn.
Established in a winner.
Right.
Roots for the Yankees, not the Mets. So there's a certain sacrilege, though.
Right. There was one
prominent Jew rooting for the Yankees.
Right. One of the interesting things about the research for Kahane is that so much of his time in America, first of all, he broadcasts publicly in the papers, where he's going to speak, when he's going to speak, what he's going to speak about. Then he speaks about it. Then he says what he spoke about. Then he's very much, and again, he was using the the newspapers to reach the masses. But in terms of researchers, he was also under FBI surveillance for a number of years, and FOIA requests have been filed, and there are tens of thousands of pages of documents where the FBI is detailing, following him. And those materials are accessible and online. And one of the interesting things that I found in the research, so when I was looking into his time as a sports reporter. I showed the articles to a number of scholars, and I said, is there like a subtext here? They're like, no, the guy just looks like he likes sports. He really likes sports. So I contacted somebody from the Yankees organization who was in the media department, and I reached out to him, and he was there for many years, and I asked him, do you recall these articles? Or he says, no, but I got to tell you a very funny Meir Kahane story. And many people in those years have a very funny Meir Kahane story. That's like one of those, so like I had no idea where he was going with this. He says one day the Yankees organization gets an alert from the police that they hear that Meir Kahane is going to be coming to a baseball game that Sunday. And they're very nervous. I mean, can they block him? Can they not allow him in? I mean, he's going to have tickets. He's not protesting. So they had a little extra security, some plainclothes officers. They knew where he was going to be sitting. And he shows up and he's there, and the Yankees organization is very nervous the whole time, and they're watching the end and he was there with one of the men in his organization in the JDL. And he, at the end of the game, he gets up and walks out. No protests, no anything. And then the guy realized, then the man in the media department says to me, he's like, and we realized it was bat day that day. He probably wanted to get a good Yankees baseball bat. And like that was a sort of, that was his release. He needed that, he loved baseball. And also his early articles in the Jewish press actually were not only political articles, they were also about Jewish law and Jewish ethics and history. And, because he was then also a pulpit rabbi, and what a rabbi speaks about. And he would,
Yeah, before we sort of zoom out to close, he did write what I would regard as a very embarrassing book. What was it called? The Jewish Stake in Vietnam.
Yeah, that was, he had a consulting company in Washington with a friend of his, and we described in the article about how he organized the JDL, and then the next day he goes down to Washington to testify at the McCarthy hearings. And again, just like, these two, synagogue one day, Washington the next day, two sanctuaries for Kahane. And he has political views about Vietnam. He is,
And it's written in 1967, just at the tipping point of support for Vietnam.
What's his argument in the book, briefly?
That we should support the U.S. continued involvement in Vietnam for the lingering threat of communism here in the United States.
But what was the Jewish stake? Because he thought communism was anti-Jewish. Is that
so?
Right. There was a perceived threat of communism, particularly to Jewish interests in the United States and Jewish power, is that it would undermine.
So he writes as an example in an article in the Jewish press in May and June, syndicated of his longer article in May and June 1967. Mind you, what's happening in Israel, the 6 Day War later happens. Writes, United States forces are today fighting in Vietnam to check communist aggression. All Americans have a stake in this grim war, but Jews have a very special interest in the successful outcome of the struggle. For wherever the communist machine achieves power, not only are political, social, and economic rights swept away, but spiritual persecution is inevitable and mercilessly practiced. Because of this, it is vital that the Jew realize the danger of to his very survival as a free human being should communism ever achieve victory. He should know that Judaism will be mercilessly attacked and his children torn from their faith. He should know that the state of Israel is a bitter target of the communists in general and the Chinese and Viet Cong in particular. The Jewish press, in line with its policy of alerting America to the degrees of totalitarianism from right and left, is writing a comprehensive series on the struggle for freedom in Vietnam. The writer, blah, 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 blah. It's like, that's a that's a Kahane article, you know? And it was a speech also.
Yeah. The more as I think about Israel, which I've done a lot, like a lot of other people since October 7th, the more I feel like Israeli politics is defined by the way the 1967 war ended, with the creation of these basically two limbo regions, and we're not really sure what they are, and the tension over that. I'm curious, did Kahane have feelings about how that war ended? Or that, yeah.
Well, it was an exemplar moment for Israel. That it represented this wellspring of enthusiasm and political muscle and military muscle, and was deeply disappointed when the momentum didn't continue. It's interesting. I would add to your analysis of the Six-Day War of June '67 being this incredibly anchoring point for modern Arab-Israeli politics. I'll also throw in is that I think a modern conception of anti-Semitism was also born out of a certain Soviet propaganda about Israel, and racism was born out of by '67 as well.
Right, and Kahane viewed the Israel's victory as a miracle. He literally uses the terms, chronology of a miracle, a step-by-step account of the events that led up to the Israeli-Arab War, and a detailed description of the war itself, its miracles and stories.
It brought him to Israel.
Yep.
I guess what I'm getting is I have a friend in Israel who's very right wing, and basically his view, which is controversial in America, but it is a view in Israel, is that Israel should never have allowed there to be an Israel-Palestine conflict. That if Israel had it had conquered the territory and then moved basically the populations into Jordan and Egypt, and they became Jordanians, Egyptians, this whole thing would have been over with then. That's a view.
That was never a policy decision of any leadership.
No, I know that. That's his view today of what they should have done. Was that Kahane's view?
Kahane's view was he was very nuanced in how he stated it. I believe it went, we should give the option for any Arab who's living in the community. We should give them the option to leave. We should provide them, resettlement packages, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if not, we should get some trucks to help them move. Now, that's a very, it's a tough thing to hear, as myself, as an American Jew, to hear that. Many people in Israel were very uncomfortable with that. I mean, Zev mentioned before about the Israeli Supreme Court, banning Kahane from serving in the Knesset. Even when he was serving in the Knesset, there were members of the parliament who would not stay in the room with him. And these are members of the Knesset who would sit with Arab politicians, but there was something pernicious about Kahane that it was too close. He wore his yarmulke. He wore, he was trying to be, a new Zionist, that came forth from America to Israel. It's a different, and look, I think a lot of the people who moved to Israel, who became his either actual followers or spiritual heirs or disciples, they all took different aspects of what his legacy was. That's part of the research that we've done is, well, what was his time in America that emerged?
Zev, do you have any?
I think that's one of when we reflect sort of how the article has been received. I think that's been one of those important points to disambiguate, which is looking at Kahane's legacy, particularly in America, shows what I'll use this term continuities and discontinuities, borrowed for Jonathan Sina, who I know was a guest of your show a while back. We are not really looking at a discontinuity of Kahaneism in the reception of Ben Gvir in the United States. There is a subtle line of continuity. which is important to resurrect certain ideas and views.
So I sort of see the two moments. Kahane is killed in this assassination in the 90s, right? And
Yep.
then we sort of come. So, what changes do you see between his assassination in the 90s and then we have this moment where Ben Gvir, who's sort of a Kahaneist, who's now in the government of Israel, comes to New York? What changes
In
jump
Israel
out?
and America. So Kahane is killed in November 1990. Are you asking particularly what has changed in America or what has changed in Israel?
That's a
Well,
great,
I would say, Zev, I would say
question.
also, I think I'll just throw out some dates. 1990, then have the Crown Heights riots, then have the World Trade Center bombing, you have the Baruch Goldstein,
Right, February 1994.
1994, you have the Yitzhak Rabin assassination, November 1995. You have the Second Intifada. You have, I'm sorry, you have 9/11. You then have the Second Intifada. I mean, you have the
Gush
dismantling
Katif,
of
liquidation of
Gaza
Gush
in
Katif in
2005. There's so
2005.
many different points to look at.
And that's why I think it's important is that Israel's really complicated. When we look at some of the written response to the article, I think I'm not sure exactly why. It has missed the argument about Meir Kahane in Israel versus America. That the emergence of Ben Gvir, who actually in America, at least verbally distanced himself from the most extreme views of Kahane, which is interesting. He said a lot of different things. Certain things were said when he was younger. He's not that old, after all. The reception in Israel is exactly that part of that timeline that Menachem elucidated. In America, it's also tied to similar views of Israel and being a part of that timeline. It has to do with the polarization of American politics. It is certainly the case that, given where he received an audience, we are seeing the departure of many segments of the American Orthodox community from the trend for Jews to vote Democrat. It's not exactly the easiest thing to disentangle. We don't report in districts about who's a Jew and what type of Judaism they subscribe to. But I think it's clear is that more and more Orthodox Jews are voting for conservative candidates opposed to liberal ones. That's a late breaking thing in the last two presidential elections. All that contributes to Kahane's and Ben Gvir now, his warm reception in the United States.
Yeah, one thing that sort of sticks out to me when I think about those debates Kahane did was you can still find liberal Jews, liberal Zionists, who will do a debate with the Ben Gvir type about we should try the two-state solution. But obviously, because of some of the events, October 7th, what happened with Gaza, the failed peace negotiations, there's that case that there's probably a little bit less people willing to make that argument. Is that something that
I
also,
think
yeah.
when trying to listen to how different communities are standing in response to October 7th, there's a whole range of responses. There's let's jump several months after. Is the purpose of the war to bring the hostages home? Is the purpose of the war to root out Hamas? Something has to go first? And just all those different details. It's going to take a long time to unpack the implications of all of the different nuances of the community. There isn't one community to speak of, about American Jews believe, or even American Orthodox Jews believe, or even American conservative or American reform. Like every community has its nuance of it. And from my perspective, we see, unfortunately, vocal individuals, are they a minority? I don't know. The point is, there are a lot of people who are vocal. It's interesting to see how not only what they say, but how community members respond to them and also don't respond to them, take them seriously or don't take them seriously. And the research that we've done into Kahane was that, at least in the 1980s and the 1980s, the Orthodox establishment, they tolerated Kahane, but they didn't, he was writing a lot. And there weren't other people who were writing for that community, that Orthodox readership or the Jewish press readership. He really had a captive audience.
I think you're right, both of you, in looking at the changed environment of the American Jewish community. Kahane was flourished in between the lines of a community that was well scaffolded, whether it be by federations or by large national organizations that were mostly Zionist.
I mean, not only national, he wanted to join the World Zionist Organization as a member. He said, I'm a Zionist, I want to join. They wouldn't welcome him, to vote for the funds from the World Zionist Organization. So you know what he did? He showed up to the World Zionist Congress and he protested outside. He's like, you're going to hear me no matter what. Like,
yeah, he
that was his,
I feel like he would have loved social media.
I don't know. I wonder that a lot. I don't know, because I think he might have gotten overwhelmed by it.
Okay.
Because he couldn't be in control of, he can't be in control of social media.
Do you have any closing thoughts to leave us with?
I'm still thinking about maybe we do need to talk again about the modern day reception. You mentioned the Zev Brenner show and other. We wrote in part of the thesis of the article is that not enough the lack of historical memory of Kahane. The Salhurak bombing obviously was a pivotal moment for those who recall, and there are people who were just shocked. I didn't know Kahane was involved in a murder, a death. I didn't know he went to jail several times. It's almost not to be believed. And that speaks to a certain low ebb of cultural literacy in our moment that hopefully articles and thinking and podcasts of the sort can help remedy.
And I think, Daniel, you mentioned you're in Chicago. An important episode in the era of Kahane were when the National Socialist Party of America marched in Skokie, Illinois. And that episode event has repercussions to this day in Chicago. It has also given voice to young activists. Well, they were young activists in 1977 throughout the Jewish community, not only in Chicago. And, when we talk about communal literacy, I'm a little less concerned about the people in Skokie or Chicago knowing about their own community, because I think local communities tend to do a good job preserving for themselves. But what about Jews in New York or California or Florida? And then also for each of those local stories, and the beauty of the internet and the beauty of podcasts and really getting the voices from people from within communities to explain and to share, documentation and their own memories and the memories of their community. That's something that, the internet has provided an amazing resource for that. I wonder if there are going to be, how somebody can write a history of, these different movements. I guess like Sam Friedman's Jew versus Jew, which he did 25 years ago, is that sort of example. Like, let's look at different case studies of different cities, but really finding more, and also having people from different communities reading the literature and not just knee-jerk rejecting, but like, wow, what's this person saying? Or how would you respond to this person?
Yeah, I got lunch in Skokie today, so I know it well. I can't wait for your book. I thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much. I really, really enjoyed it.